Do you know who I am? I donated $10 million to this building!
The ICU never really slept. Monitors beeped in steady rhythms, the air carried that mix of antiseptic and quiet tension, and the nurses on this floor moved fast and talked little, because here a wasted second could cost a life. Amara Bennett had worked this unit for 6 years. She was 31, black, with locks pulled back into a low bun and a calm, steady presence that the younger nurses leaned on whenever a vein collapsed, a family fell apart in the hallway, or a patient coded at 3 in the morning and nobody else knew what to do. She was the floor's quiet center. She was also 7 months pregnant. Her feet ached by the second hour of every shift, and a dull pull settled into her lower back somewhere around hour 4. She never mentioned it. She'd just rest a hand on her belly between rooms, breathe slowly, and keep moving. Nobody on the floor knew much about her life outside those walls. She never talked about where she grew up, never mentioned family, and changed the subject gently whenever anyone asked. That was deliberate. Nobody was supposed to know that the soft-spoken nurse adjusting in 4-line in room 6 was the foster sister of a man named Marcus Voss. Marcus didn't work in hospitals, and he didn't show up on the city's social pages. He moved through the underworld of the Pacific Northwest like a current beneath still water, invisible until the moment he decided to surface. He had no official organization, no name attached to police files, no public face at all. And for years, he had kept that entire world away from Amara, not out of shame, but because she'd asked him to. "Let me be normal," she'd told him once, back when they were teenagers. "Let me just be a person." He had honored that. But peace has a way of attracting enemies it never asked for. At 2:14 in the afternoon, the double doors at the end of the ICU hallway slammed open. Every head on the floor turned. The man walking through wore a charcoal suit worth more than most of the nurses made in 3 months. His name was Garrett Holloway, 44 years old, founder of 3 tech companies, and a man who had never once heard the word "no" without making someone regret saying it. Behind him, a nervous assistant pressed a folded cloth to Garrett's palm, where a small cut sat, the kind you'd get from a broken wine glass, the kind that needed a bandage, not an ICU bed. Garrett didn't know that. Or didn't care. He scanned the unit like it already belonged to him, which in his mind it nearly did. His last donation had funded the hospital's new cardiac wing, and he kept the board's thank you letter framed in his office. "I need a doctor. Now," he said, his voice cutting clean over the monitors. "Not a resident, not a student. A real one." A young physician named Ethan Cole hurried over, palms raised, trying to explain that this floor handled critical care, that the assistant's cut was minor, that the main ER was 2 floors down. Garrett grabbed his coat and shoved him sideways. The whole floor seemed to stop breathing at once. Garrett kept walking, eyes scanning for an empty bed and a nurse he could order around, heading straight toward the room of a 67-year-old man recovering from open-heart surgery. Amara stepped out of room 6. She didn't rush, didn't raise her voice. Garrett stopped in his tracks. His jaw tightened as he looked at her the way certain powerful men look at people they've already decided don't matter, like furniture that had suddenly started talking. "Do you know who I am?" His voice dropped low and ugly. "I donated $4 million to this building. I'll have your badge pulled before your shift ends." "That's your right," Amara said, not moving an inch. "But you're still not coming through this hallway." Something cracked behind his controlled anger, and something colder slid into its place. He pulled a leather card holder from his jacket and held it toward Ethan, who was now pressed flat against the wall. "Write me a number," Garrett said. "Whatever it takes to move one of these patients somewhere else. I don't care which one. I need this bed." Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Amara answered instead. "Put that away." Her voice didn't shake once. "Money doesn't decide which patients are stable enough to move. The man in room 4 had open heart surgery 11 hours ago. He is not being relocated for a cut on your hand. Garrett turned to her slowly, the card holder still open in his palm. You're a nurse, he said, like the word itself was an insult. You don't make those calls here. I do. For a moment, nobody in the unit breathed. Then Garrett let loose, loud, ugly, relentless. He called her incompetent. He mocked her scrubs, her education, her paycheck, her place. He said things that made the nurses at the station stare at the floor in shame. Amara absorbed every word without flinching, then turned toward the wall phone to call security. That was when he hit her. The sound was wrong for a hospital, too sharp, too loud. It split the quiet of the ICU like something breaking that was never supposed to break. His open hand caught the side of her face with full force. Her head snapped sideways, the clipboard in her hand clattering to the floor. She stumbled, her shoulder catching the edge of the nurse's station, both hands flying instinctively to the curve of her belly, wrapping around it, protecting it. She didn't fall, but her eyes closed for a second, and that second said everything. The floor went silent in a way that wasn't peaceful at all. A young nurse named Sofia Reyes stood frozen at her station, both hands pressed over her mouth. A security guard near the elevator had his hand on his radio but hadn't moved. Nobody had moved. It felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the building. Garrett straightened his cuffs. Maybe now you understand how this works, he said. Down near the exit stairwell, a tall man in a black coat had been standing with his hands in his pockets since the doors first opened. He'd watched all of it, the shove, the threats, the slap, the way Amara's hands had flown to her stomach. A small tattoo sat on the side of his neck, wolf's eye, half open, staring straight ahead. He didn't raise his voice or reach for anything. He simply took out his phone, typed 4 words, sent them, and walked out a side door. 60 seconds later, Dr. Whitfield arrived, chief of medicine, 62, silver-haired, known for staying composed in a crisis. He took in the scene, Amara steadying herself against the counter, Garrett standing with his arms crossed. He made his decision in under 3 seconds. He chose wrong. Mr. Holloway. Dr. Whitfield moved toward Garrett with his hand extended, his voice smooth. I'm so sorry for this. Let's get you taken care of immediately. Amara stared at him. He never once looked her way. Garrett rolled his shoulders. Your nurse was aggressive. She obstructed patient care. I defended myself. Dr. Whitfield nodded like he was hearing a weather report. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't ask a single witness. He didn't glance at the red mark spreading across the face of the pregnant woman 10 feet away. He turned to Amara, and his voice went flat. I'm going to have to let you go. Effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and clear out your locker. The shock didn't come from the words, she'd half expected them the second Whitfield walked in without checking on her first. It came from the witnesses, the nurses, doctors, and security guards who had just watched a man slap a pregnant woman across the face, now suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. 2 security guards walked her out, not roughly, but with the stiff formality of people following orders. She handed over her badge, emptied her locker into a paper bag, and walked the long corridor past the patients she'd cared for, past the break room where she'd eaten 1,000 quiet lunches, past the room where she'd once held a dying man's hand because no family had come. The front doors opened to cold, rainy air. She stood on the wet sidewalk and checked her phone. There was already an email from a law firm. Garrett Holloway was suing her for emotional distress and professional interference. She read it twice. Then she started walking. By the next morning, her bank card was declined at the grocery store. Her accounts were frozen. Garrett's legal team had moved fast. When she got home, an eviction notice was taped to her door. She sat in her dark apartment, both hands resting on her belly, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped. She had built this life, Clean, earned, entirely her own, over 6 years, one shift at a time. Now it had collapsed in a single afternoon. She let herself sit with that for a long while. Then she got up, went to her closet, moved a stack of boxes aside, and pulled out a fireproof case. Inside was a phone she charged once a year, just in case. Just in case had arrived. She dialed a number she'd memorized a decade ago. Marcus picked up on the first ring. He already knew, he'd been in that hallway. He'd watched the slap happen in real time, watched her hands fly to her stomach, watched the chief of medicine choose a donor over his best nurse. He'd walked out that side door only because Amara had made him promise years ago that he'd never act unless she asked him to. He'd spent the last 22 hours waiting for the call. When her voice came through, quiet and breaking at the edges, he closed his eyes. "I need help," she said. That was all. "You don't have to say anything else," Marcus said, his voice steadier than it had ever been. "Go to sleep. I'll handle it." He set the phone down on the glass table in his penthouse office, looked out at the city lights, and made 4 calls. By morning, Garrett Holloway's problems had already begun. He found out at dinner, at his private club, in a leather chair, 2 absurdly expensive bottles of wine ordered to celebrate the fact that a pregnant nurse had just been walked out of a building he half believed he owned. When he placed his card on the tray, the waiter came back 2 minutes later wearing the expression of a man who wished he worked anywhere else. Declined. Garrett snatched the card and called his banker. 6 missed calls were already waiting. His company's stock had dropped 19% in 3 hours. His 3 offshore accounts, chosen specifically for their privacy, were empty. Not withdrawn. Just empty, as if the money had never existed. Then his head of security got a text. Garrett watched the color drain from the man's face, watched him pocket his phone, stand, and walk out of the club without a word. Garrett sat alone with 2 untouched bottles and no way to pay for them. He spent the night trying to fix it. He had names, dangerous ones, men who made inconvenient problems disappear for important people. The first one he met in a parking garage at midnight. Garrett slid a bag of cash across the hood of a car and showed him a black envelope he'd found in his mailbox that evening, sealed in dark red wax and stamped with the image of a wolf's eye. The man studied it for a long moment, then pushed the cash back, got in his car, and drove off. The second fixer didn't even sit down. He saw the seal and shook his head before Garrett finished a sentence. The third, a man with a badly broken nose and a reputation for taking jobs nobody else would touch, looked at the seal, looked at Garrett, and said quietly, "You hit someone you shouldn't have touched. Nobody in this city is taking this job. Not for any price." "Why?" Garrett demanded. The man looked at him with something between pity and disgust. "Because whoever sent that envelope doesn't negotiate. He just collects." At 2 a.m., Garrett drove to his private airfield. He had a jet, he had cash, he had a plan: leave the country, find somewhere without extradition, rebuild from zero. He was 50 feet from the steps when headlights cut through the dark, 3 black SUVs rolling out from the edges of the tarmac like they'd been waiting there for hours. They had been. 6 men stepped out. No weapons in sight, no raised voices. They simply took his arms, put a bag over his head, and drove. When the bag came off, Garrett was kneeling on cold marble in an enormous, nearly dark room. At the far end of a long table, under a single light, sat the man from the hospital hallway, a cup of tea in front of him, the wolf's eye tattoo clearly visible on his neck. Marcus set down his cup and looked at Garrett the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved. Garrett's instincts went straight to aggression, the only tool he'd ever needed. "I have connections at the federal level," he said, voice cracking. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Marcus slid a tablet across the table until it stopped at Garrett's knees. On the screen, ICU security footage, full resolution, time stamped. The shove. The screaming. The slap. Amara's hands flying to her stomach. The guards walking her out. Dr. Whitfield nodding along like a man being told good news. Garrett stared at it in silence. You thought she was alone, Marcus finally said, quiet enough that Garrett had to lean in to hear it. You thought nobody was coming. He leaned forward. She has me. A lawyer stepped out of the shadows with a stack of documents. Marcus laid out the terms without a flicker of emotion, every asset, the companies, the properties, the vehicles, the patents, even the emergency cash already smoldering in a barrel in the corner of the room, transferred immediately into an irreversible trust for underprivileged single mothers across the city. Garrett sobbed through the signing. Real tears, not from guilt, but from the particular grief of watching power leave your hands forever. When it was done, the bag went back over his head. They drove for 20 minutes, then pushed him out onto wet pavement. He rolled twice before stopping, tore the bag off, and looked up at a hospital emergency entrance sign, the same building, the same parking lot where Amara had once stood in the rain holding a paper bag of her belongings. Garrett Holloway sat in the rain with nothing but the clothes on his back. Then the police cars arrived, because while he'd been scrambling through the city that week, Marcus had quietly delivered 10 years of his financial fraud records, tax evasion, embezzlement, wire fraud, all meticulously documented, to 3 separate federal agencies, anonymously and completely. The officers stepped out. Garrett didn't run. There was nowhere left to go. Morning light came soft through the windows of a private suite on the 7th floor. Flowers sat on the sill, and the quiet hum of a newborn's breathing filled the room. Amara held her daughter against her chest and looked out at the city skyline. The baby had her grandmother's nose, a full head of dark curls, and a set of lungs that had announced her arrival to the entire floor. She was perfect. Marcus stood near the door, hands folded, looking at his niece with an expression Amara had never once seen on his face, open, unguarded, human. He'd bought the hospital 4 months earlier, quietly, through 3 shell companies. The board hadn't known who owned it until the paperwork finalized. Once they did, Dr. Whitfield resigned quietly, though it turned out not to matter, since the new ownership had already begun processing his termination. These days, Whitfield worked 2 floors below, not as a doctor. The janitorial staff had been short-handed. As Amara watched her daughter sleep, she heard the squeak of a mop bucket in the hallway. She glanced toward the open door and saw him, older looking than she remembered, eyes down, moving slowly. He passed the doorway, looked in, saw her, looked away immediately, and kept walking. She didn't call after him. She didn't need to. She looked back down at her daughter's face. Marcus crossed the room and stood beside the bed, studying the baby for a long moment before looking at Amara. You good? She laughed, small, real, exhausted. Yeah, she said. I'm good. He nodded once, like that settled something he'd been carrying for a long time. Across town, in a federal holding facility, Garrett Holloway sat on a metal bench in an orange jumpsuit. The wealth was gone. The legal team was gone. The investors, the board, the club friends who'd once toasted him over champagne, all gone. He had spent 44 years building a life where no was a word other people said, never him. Now he understood, fully and finally, what happens when you're wrong about that. Amara kissed her daughter's forehead and breathed in the warmth of her. The storm had passed, not simply because a powerful man had fallen, though he had, and not because a coward in a white coat was now pushing a mop, though he was. It had passed because she was here, in this room, with her daughter breathing softly against her chest and her brother standing quietly at the door, and the world outside no longer had any claim on her at all. She had spent her whole life fighting for an ordinary one. She hadn't realized that sometimes, the people who love you fight for it too. The quietest people in a room are never the weakest. They're just the ones who haven't decided to move yet.